Hey guys, enjoying the con so far? Well, thank you for coming to the Death Note panel, the psychology of Death Note. I'm Heather Ness. I go by Super Psych on the internet, and I talk about different pop cultural things, mostly superheroes, but I'm branching off into anime and video games. And I'll watch them or digest them in some form and talk about the psychology behind them. My background, I have a master's degree in clinical psychology. So when I look at these things, I'm kind of looking through that very specific lens, like what are the different characters dealing with, are they diagnosable, whatever. I also teach psychology courses in Macon at Middle Georgia State College.
My name is Avery Moody. I'm a graphic designer and musician and by day, and then I enjoy anime, all sorts of pop culture. And in my work, I like to kind of reverse engineer things. When I design things, I like to look really closely at different advertisements or different designs that I like, figure out what makes me like them, and then I incorporate that into my work. Same thing with my music. And same thing when I'm trying to tell stories. I like to look really closely at stories, find out what makes me like them, and then try to take those pieces and make my own things.
So we'll be talking about Death Note, which is one of my favorites. We'll also be doing another one of probably my top favorite is Psychopath, and we'll be doing that one at 3 o'clock. But we're going to talk about Death Note, specifically two of the characters, main characters, Light and L.
Yeah. So like I said, I really like looking very closely at things that I enjoy, and what this crazy thing over here shows is that I have way too much time on my hands. And this thing is called a story clock. It was invented by a screenwriter named Seth Worley. And he has a company called Plot Devices, which makes tools for screenwriters, storytellers, things like this. He's got a story clock notebook, and then he's got like a storyboard notebook. Anyway, what this thing does is there's certain patterns when you're telling a story. So you're watching like a 2-hour movie. You would watch the movie, and every time something important happens in the story, you would write it down, pause the movie, and write down a notch, a little note. Write down what you thought was important, and then go from there. And then once you have the whole clock filled up, you can start to look for patterns. Look for, hey, what's here, what's on the other side of this clock. And when you're developing your own stories, when you have a story idea, a really good story idea, you don't get a whole 2-hour movie or a whole 5-season series all at once. When you have an idea, you have fragments of an idea. So you can sit down, you can write down your fragments, then start thinking, hey, I want this thing to happen at this time in the story, and then I want this thing to happen here. And then once you get all your ideas, you're going to have a partially filled clock. You can start filling in your clock organically based off what you have. You can say, hey, this thing is something I want to happen here. How am I going to set that up over here? If I have this thing at 6 o'clock, what's going to happen at midnight? Stuff like that. So I took a look at the very first episode of Death Note, Rebirth, and a note, if you're using this story clock, for a 2-hour movie, there's going to be some times between important things happening, and that's kind of how it was designed for. But when you're watching a 23-minute anime, you have to write furiously. An important thing happens every minute, which is okay. That's why you have the pause button. So I'm not going to walk you through every second of this episode, but I'll show you some of the patterns I was looking for. So I was paying attention to, for a first episode of any new thing, I was paying attention to the exposition. Because exposition is usually like the clunkiest part of introducing a new world. But yet somehow Death Note introduces its lore, introduces its main, the titular plot device, introduces it very well. It's not clunky or anything. It's not like hitting you over the head with narration right off the bat. So I wanted to take a closer look at how it does that, how it makes you feel like you're part of the story without feeling like you're on the outside. So how it starts off is with this blue lines bouncing around. It starts off with visual exposition. No words, you just see Ryuk in the Shinigami realm, and you see him bored and isolated, and you can take all that from context because it doesn't show you, it is not talking to you, just you see him sitting around. Then it bounces over to Light. He's in a similar situation. You're kind of a fly on the wall in his classroom, and he's also bored and isolated. So it doesn't hit you over the head with a big title scroll. It doesn't, show a backflash or whatever. It's just showing you this is where this character is, this is where this character is, and letting you take context cues to figure out how they're feeling. And they're very obviously bored and isolated in each of the frames that it shows you. Then it goes on, Light's walking home from school, and it starts with this green bouncy line here. It's his internal dialogue. So right off the bat, immediately it puts you in his headspace, and he's talking about how he looks at the world. And he expresses that he's numb. And I've circled in red here, this is a split screen where it's showing Ryuk talking to himself, and it's showing Light talking to himself. And then the panels both come up at the same time, and they both say, at the same time, the world is rotten. And I guess I felt like it was very important to note that it was showing both these characters at the same time, saying the same thing, kind of reflecting each other. And these red lines that I've written, you can't see me pointing at anything. The red lines are the relationship between Ryuk and Light. The blue line is, like I said, visual exposition. So it shows Light picking up the book. One of the things that I really like about Death Note, and you get to see, are the rules that the book shows. It reminded me of this literary principle called Chekhov's gun, which is a pretty common. Basically, this guy named Chekhov it really annoyed him when he saw plot elements not used, unused plot elements. So he basically said, if you have a gun on the wall, you have to have that gun go off. And that's just his opinion, but it's kind of a good principle when you're writing a story. And Death Note uses it really well with its rules. As soon as you see him reading the rules, they don't come into play immediately, but throughout the course, it's kind of my favorite parts when you get to see the different rules come into play. So I'm not going to walk through the rest of the episode. I'm just going to skip to the very end, the last part. So up until this part, it's been doing just internal dialogue and visual exposition. And then about halfway through, there's a big exposition dump where Light meets Ryuk for the first time. And they have this big conversation where it makes a job as a literary analysis really easy, because they ask each other questions that you're asking, like, why did you do this? What's your motivation? And they give each other very long answers that you can basically just write down the dialogue and you can fill in. So since I was pausing and writing down dialogue and thinking about it, there's something that caught my eye. An interesting answer to a question where Ryuk is asking Light why he was doing all this, why he used the Death Note so much, because no one had ever used it that much before. And Light said because he wanted to he wanted the world to see him killing criminals, because it's easy for the world to figure out that someone's killing criminals. He wanted someone to know that someone was out there using something to kill criminals. And Ryuk asks him, why do you want that? And then Light responds, so that the world will know that someone is judging them. And then Ryuk asks, what's the point of judging people? And instead of giving a straight response to that question, Light responds with, I guess I was bored. And then Ryuk kind of responds to him and says, humans are so interesting. So, I'm going to ask our psychology expert, what type of person answers a question like that with, I was just bored, and what makes that so interesting?
Well, it's kind of interesting that you lead that into me, because like the whole point of psychology, or the motivation for psychologists, is why do people do the things that they do? Why do they behave in certain ways? And the implied, well, the overt motivation behind that is so we can understand people better. The implied implication, or the underneath implication, is how can we make them change? Or how can we help them do better, but mostly how can we change their behavior? If we know why they do things, how can we change it? So, with that in my own background, I was watching Death Note, and any times that I watch something with characters in it, I want to know what are their motivations? Why are they doing this thing that they do? And like you just painted out for us, there are different motivations that are talked about in the very first episode of Death Note. They map it all out very neatly. Ryuk drops the Death Note because he's in the Shinigami world, and it kind of sucks there, and there's nothing really going on besides just occasionally writing in your Death Note or gambling. And he doesn't get too entertained by any of that, so he's just bored, so he drops the Death Note. And when he keeps quizzing Light, kind of in the same way a therapist would with somebody in front of them, and keeps trying to get at, well, what's behind that? What's behind that? Light finally gets to, I was bored as well. So he maps out his own motivations for all of his actions throughout the series. Some of it has to do with the world is rotten, someone needs to fix it. So a very heroic, you might say, or protagonistic at least, motivation. He wants to fix the world, make the world better. He thinks of himself as justice. He wants to, a certain extent, have some recognition. He has to have the recognition, and the world creates the persona of Kira for him. But they know that someone is there. And even though it doesn't equal, like they don't know that it's Light, he knows that his actions are having effect. And so he gets some fulfillment from knowing that he's having this big of an effect. And part of it is just that he's straight up bored. One thing that really gets discussed a lot, as I was looking at different conversations, mostly on Tumblr, and then also like in various places, people talk about Death Note, and a lot of times I hear, yeah, all of the characters are sociopaths or psychopaths, and they're just at odds with each other, and they all have different motivations, but they're all just really horrible people. So because I have a background in psychology, I have like this weird little irksome pet peeve. where we throw around different diagnoses. Which don't necessarily match up. So what I like to do is like, all right, we think that maybe this guy has this diagnosis. Let's watch it. Let's see if it meets the criteria. Sociopath is an interesting one because it's not a diagnosis. It's a psychology term, but it's not like an official one. Neither is psychopath. They're just terms that we use in conversation, and there's actually a difference between the two. A psychopath is someone who kind of was just born that way. These are like those little 3-year-old kids who want to set fire to the family cat. A sociopath is someone who eventually develops this pattern of behavior, some sort of destructive pattern of behavior. But maybe if they had had different life events or life experiences, they might not have turned out that way. So the difference between socio and psycho. Does it come from straight within me as an innate, or did my society, my social life events have some sort of effect on it? So I wanted to look at, is Light actually what we would call a psychopath or a sociopath? Or does he meet any kind of diagnostic criteria for some sort of diagnosis? So some things, really important personality characteristics about Light that stood out to me. I talked about his motivations, but this is like getting at who he is as a person. He goes from, just in the first episode even, he goes from, oh my God, I just killed someone, does writing in this book make me a murderer, to, I am the god of this new world, very quickly. He makes that switch very, very quickly. He takes on this persona of Kira. He says, I am justice. He is the only one who could possibly clean up this rotten new world. It's not just that he got the death notes and he can use it, but he was destined for this. Even when Ryuk tells him, this was totally an accident. You're not all that special. Sure, you're smart, but I just dropped this and you happened to pick it up. There was no destiny. But even after Ryuk says that, and it's made pretty blatant, Light still goes forward with, this is my purpose, and only I can do this. Never really thinking, well, what could have happened if someone else had picked it up? Or what would happen if I could just put this death note down and not use it at all? So 2 things that stood out to me, mostly that narcissism, that I am somehow special and incredibly self-important. So just looking at those 2, as I'm looking at it through the eyes of like a clinician, and trying to narrow down, what could Light possibly have? There are 2 kinds of personality disorders that stood out to me for Light. Here's the thing about personality disorders. 1, they're incredibly hard to diagnose and to treat. Because someone with a personality disorder, they might have, these disorders might have very negative effects on their lives, but because it's part of who they are inherently, it's hard for them to even want to seek treatment. A lot of times it looks like other people just have problems with who they are as people. They don't come in for treatment too much. Even if they do come into treatment, imagine trying to treat someone for being who you are. Treatment essentially is trying to change their personality. Incredibly difficult. And also incredibly ambiguous. For example, who am I exactly to look at somebody and how they live their lives and their personality and then point to them and being like, that's not like me, so that's bad. With that putting out there, we have the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition, which is kind of like the Bible for psychologists. And in it, we have all the different mental disorders that we're talking about right now, and we'll add to it and take it away with different additions. And in it, you have all the criteria. What do they need to make this? And our system kind of works like, You could have 4 symptoms, and these 4 symptoms have really negative effects on your life. But if the criteria says that you need to have 5 symptoms, you don't have that diagnosis. And your insurance company doesn't pay for any kind of treatment. So obviously you're still dealing with those 4 symptoms, and it sucks. But because you don't meet all the criteria of 5, you don't get it. So with those things in mind, I narrowed it down to 2 psychology disorders, or personality disorders, that make sense for light to me. These personality disorders, these 2, belong to the same, we call it cluster, a grouping of personality disorder. And the thing about this particular cluster is they have something in common, and all of it has to do with a lack of empathy. So not being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and feel what they're feeling. So the first one, antisocial personality disorder. This is the diagnosis for what we typically refer to as someone as being a psychopath or a sociopath. This is the actual diagnosis. And the thing about this one is you only need 1 criteria to get it. You need to either just have a complete disregard for any kind of laws or social norms. And as I go through these, think about failure to obey any laws or norms, which at least could, if you got caught, warrant arrest. You don't have to get caught. A pattern of lying, impulsive behavior, irritability, aggression, blatantly disregards safety of self and others, pattern of irresponsibility, what an ambiguous criteria, and lack of remorse for actions. So not having any kind of regret or feelings of guilt or repentance. And because it's a personality disorder, and you can't give these personality disorders to kids. Because, they're growing up, they're changing, they're figuring out who they are. So you could easily give this to a 3-year-old, but you shouldn't, because they're still growing up. Pattern of irresponsibility. Disregard of safety as they jump down the stairs. No, so there's a reason why we can't give this to kids. They have to be an adult. Their personality has to be somewhat cemented. And just for ASPD, you need one of these. Over in the next one with narcissistic personality disorder, so similar in that they don't have any kind of empathy for other people. They need at least 5. So this incredible sense of self-importance that I am somehow higher up and better than other people, that I deserve to be in a place of power, to have lots of money, to have all of this recognition, for people to love and adore me. I am special. You little people don't really get me. I'm only really understood by other people who are like me. Too bad there's not more of you. They need that recognition, that admiration. They need people stroking their egos all the time. With relationships, their point for relationships isn't necessarily to have a bond with another person, it's to get something out of them. The lack of empathy, feeling like other people are always envious of them, because they should be, but also somewhat feeling envious of other people, like they're not as good as me, why do they have that? I should have that. And of course being arrogant. So needing at least 5 of these. So let me throw it out to you guys. Do you think that light could be either of these? Yeah. Do you have a leaning towards one or the other? Narcissistic. LOL. So just narcissistic, not the antisocial one. Yeah, but leaning more towards narcissism. You could have both, which honestly would just be a bad time. Death note.
Yeah.
All right, so possibly. So the other character that I wanted to look at, because I love him and he's my son, is L. looking at the same thing. I had a conversation with somebody, and they were saying, both Light and L are sociopaths. And I was like, all right, with Light, I hear you. With L, how dare you attack my son? He's not a sociopath. He has a great time. And then I was like, well, is he? So let me go back and watch all of this. He calls himself extremely arrogant. Like, that's pretty... He has no qualms about that whatsoever. And it's never stated in the same way that it is for Ryuk and Light, but there is an implied sense of boredom that goes along with L. Because in it, I mean, he's the world's greatest detective, but he only takes cases that interest him. So is he necessarily motivated by, well, let me take this case because this is going to help make the world a better place? Not really. It's more like, here's a cool puzzle that I've never seen before that might challenge me and interest me. And kind of implying that he's so smart that he's bored and he needs something to entertain him, to stimulate him.
Yeah, that's a good point. You just saying that made me think that he might need to be needed because he only comes in, because the world already has its own organizations that solve crimes, even big crimes on a big scale, terrorism, and he only comes in when he's like the most needed, because otherwise he's kind of that annoying Sherlock Holmes character that shows up and takes everyone's jobs, and he's not comfortable being that guy. He wants to be needed, so he kind of needs a puzzle. His intellect isolates him, which also puts him in the same category as Ryuk and Light, who felt bored and isolated.
All right, I like that. So the motivation is to feel needed. I like it. He does blatantly mirrors Light in the whole I am justice. They do another split screen, I believe, in the second episode, kind of like when Light does a split screen with Ryuk, the world is a rotten place. Second episode, he does a split screen with L, I am justice. Later on, as he's criminally profiling Kira, some of the other detectives ask him, like, how do you know that Kira was going to act in this way? And L talks about, because he calls him, Kira is childish and wants to win. And they're like, how do you know that? And L says, because I am also childish, and I would like to win. So that's part of his motivation. There's a challenge in front of him. Maybe he originally got into it because he wanted to be needed, but now that he's in it, and it's stimulating him, it's puzzling him, and entertaining him, his competitive side is awakened. And then maybe he's also just bored. So I flipped it back and went, all right, people are saying, maybe he fits the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And he labels himself pretty blatantly that he is also extremely arrogant, one of the symptoms for narcissistic personality disorder. And several times he's just kind of a jerk. It's fine. So let me throw it back to you guys. With regards to L, do you think that he meets either of these two criteria, looking at it through the lens of a clinical psychologist? You believe that some people can just be dicks. I also believe that. More on that in a moment.